hello. Today, we've got with us Leland Miller. This is Danielle DiMartino Booth with Valuetainment Economics. We bring you Leland today because he is the China data whisperer. He knows more about China than most people in China know about China. But for those of you unfamiliar with Leland and the China Beige book, first of all, let's jump in with asking Leland what got him so interested in following China. How did it start?
Well, I grew up in DC and I grew up doing China issues on Capitol Hill as a teenager. And this sort of got me pulled into the universe of US China policy. I went to college, I studied Mandarin. Back then, it was the unfortunate situation where if you were a Spanish speaker or a French speaker, you couldn't take Spanish 101 or French 101. They didn't have the rule for Chinese native speakers. So I took several years of getting brutalized in Chinese class during college, moved on, went to Taiwan, did graduate language training in Mandarin, and went and got my master's in Chinese history afterwards. And then I sort of dove headfirst in the corporate legal world for a number of years, doing law in New York and Hong Kong. And eventually I just got pulled into a world of policy, which was captivating me a lot more. And within that world, the most exciting part of this was the economics, because there was very little coming out, and there's still very little coming out that has to do with real data, real information coming out of China that's not part of Beijing's own narrative, own trumpeting of its own reality.
So I guess you could say that it's kind of an open secret, if you will, that what you're talking about, that Chinese data are manufactured, that they're massaged, that they fit a narrative. Why should the average layperson be concerned with data coming out of China? I mean, I did a little bit of homework before this, and I think the last time China had as large of an economic footprint was maybe in the year 700, if I'm remembering correctly, in terms of the size of the global economy. But maybe you can walk us through kind of the past 20, 30 years and the evolution of China's rise as a global economic superpower, which I think we could argue that they certainly are, and then bring into it data and how data should form the way we think and see and perceive the country.
Right. Well, 20, 30 years ago, China was a very developing economy. It didn't have that large of an economic footprint. You look right now, it's the second largest economy in the world, the largest number of people in the world. It's an enormous country on the rise. And what's interesting is that despite the fact that we've seen this enormous emergence of China over the past 20 or 30 years, markets in general have been rather complacent about getting better information out of it. I mean, think about US information. There is a US indicator for everything imaginable. You go to Europe, every single type of information, micro and macro, you can get that information. If you don't, someone will invent it soon enough. That's not the case in China. We're still treating China like it's this baby economy from 20 or 30 years ago, because markets are only relying on information coming out of Beijing and a handful of smaller indicators now run by and large by Chinese companies. It doesn't give the full picture on China. And even if all the data coming out of Beijing did give you unblemished truth, they never lied, they never manipulated, they never juiced any piece of data. The problem is they don't put out that much of it. So they leak out what they like, they leak out certain amounts, and then markets are left to grasp with how does one sector look against another? Regionally, what's the difference between a coastal China and a periphery China? And so right now, despite the fact that there are hundreds of billions of dollars of commerce going back and forth between the US and China and Europe and China, and it's global commerce center, you just don't have that much information coming out of it. And what you do is filtered through the government lens. So it's a very unique and quite problematic situation to be in.
So can you kind of quantify, if you will, China's global footprint, how big China is, whether you're talking about gross domestic product, the size of their economic output, or as that of an exporting nation, as well as the rise of the Chinese consumer, which I think is one of the least appreciated stories in the past 5 or 10 years.
Right. Well, some of my information on GDP may be a little bit outdated, but essentially you're looking at a GDP number in the teens, in the low teens, or almost to the low teens. The U.S. is close, around 20 trillion, and you've got a Chinese number that's maybe 11 or 12. But it's the reason that I don't pay attention to it that much is that, as you say, there's a lot of different ways to look at China, and one of the worst is to look at the GDP number. Because China's always had this enormous fixation on the GDP number because big growth equals big success. But that's not what happens. And what you see is that this has become a part of the Chinese model. Whereas, if the Chinese want to hit a certain economic number, then they'll just build. So the old joke was, if you want to hit 8% GDP, you build a bridge, you tear it down, you build the same bridge again, you tear it down, you build the same bridge again, you tear it down, and you keep going until you hit your GDP number. Because GDP measures aggregate growth and not productive growth. And the largest problem with the Chinese economy right now is there's not enough productivity baked into what they're doing. Enormous non-performing loans, enormous waste, enormous inefficiencies, and they're trying to get away from it, but it's very difficult after decades of being trained to focus on growth at all costs. And I think the other way to look at this, of course, is if you look at per capita GDP, let's assume that has meaning right now, China has 1.4 billion plus people. So they're still a developing economy. They're still nowhere near middle income levels of growth, and which would make them in the same ballpark as Japan or Europe or the United States. It's still a very poor country, and it's a country that's getting older. So on the one hand, you've got this extraordinary economic powerhouse, tons of people, tons of economic growth. On the other hand, you've got this enormous population that's very poor, it's very male, it's very old. And so there are these obstacles to China jumping to the next step that are not the same things that we saw with the Asian tigers, that we saw with the US in the early days, that we saw with Europe. So China's got their own unique set of problems right now that they're trying to work through.
So the China watching industry, I've been on Wall Street, I've been in investments, I've been a Federal Reserve insider. I've played all kinds of roles and worn all kinds of hats, but the China watching industry seems to be something that has evolved. Explain to us how it used to work and how it works today. And the catchphrase that you mentioned, that the first derivative of crap is still crap. So walk me through that.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep that from being our company motto. But the way this has always worked is that because there's been this focus on China, but not ever a desire to hold Chinese, to hold Beijing accountable for good data, to create new sources of data, there's always been this idea that because China's communist, it's a black box, it's opaque, you cannot get data out of it. And because of that, you just have to accept whatever they give you, and that's as good as it gets. Now, the fact that I'm here speaking to you right now shows that that's not the truth, but it's been something that people have held as truth for a number of years. Now, back in the old day, when people were really focused even more than they are now on China's quarterly growth numbers, but also some of these monthly industrial output, retail sales consumption numbers, what the Chinese government would do invariably is set out a list of forecasts for what numbers they wanted to hit. They had targets. And then they would always hit those targets with a little bit of movement on each side. So if you could read Chinese and you knew who to follow, former monetary policy economists, former Beijing insiders, you could read the Chinese press, understand where they were predicting growth. You knew the Chinese government was going to always hit their targets. So this China watching industry for multiple decades was based around the idea, not on quantifying data, not on research, not on doing any real work. It was about understanding what Beijing's targets are, understanding that they were always going to hit those targets, and then predicting them before anyone else in the Western press saw it. And hey, you're a China analyst. And that world existed for a long, long time. And the funny thing about this is, we're in 2020 now. And when we first started China Beige Book back in 2010, I told my team, we probably have 2 or 3 years before the whole world catches up with us, does the same thing as we're trying to do, which is trying to get real data, real big data out of the Chinese economy. Because in today's world where everything runs on big data, numbers, algorithms, how could you not go in that direction? So I figured we had about 2 or 3 years before everybody else chased after us, and we were in a dogfight for who had the best data. A decade later, and we are the only people still who are doing large scale private data inside the Chinese economy.
So, what is a China Beige Book? I used to work at the Fed. I know what the Beige Book is for the Fed. I know that is an anecdotal gathering that you can eventually quantify and make into data that gives you a feel for how different aspects of the geographic U.S. economy are, and different aspects of the sectorials, different sectors here and there of the U.S. economy. It all comes together in a big book. What is the China Beige Book, first of all?
Well, China Beige Book obviously modeled itself, at least at the very beginning, off what the Federal Reserve does, what you're talking about, the Beige Book. And the Beige Book for the United States is something that is qualitative. The various districts, as you know, have reports coming in from their business leaders and their companies, and they sort of put together this qualitative sketch of the entire country from the ground up. And this was very different than the other kind of data you're seeing that markets were using, which is heavily quantitative and heavily macro. And so this provided a new flavor. Now, when we went into China to try to figure out the best way of attacking the idea of data collection, we started with the Beige Book model, a Beige Book-esque model, which was heavily qualitative. We were asking firms for their qualitative views, and then we had the other half was quantitative. And what we figured out very quickly was that who cares about the qualitative stuff? The reason that the Beige Book in the United States was different and useful is that the quantitative stuff had already been done, and so this provided a new wrinkle. What we were realizing is we're the only team doing quantitative data in China. So we started reducing the footprint on the qualitative side over the course of the first 18 months until we eliminated it entirely. And now we are a quantitative look at the economy. And what that means is, you look at indicators right now that come out with a couple hundred firms. We survey over 3,300 firms. We release data 8 times a year. We track 7 different sectors. We track 34 discrete subsectors. But we don't just focus on growth. If you're used to getting a number in the press for how's China doing, you either see like a 6% GDP number or a 50.2 PMI number. Nobody knows what those numbers mean. And what we figured out very quickly as well is that just having the idea that growth can be boiled down to one number is too simplistic. So we started tracking growth and, of course, tracking all output and cash flow and all these other growth indicators, sales, revenue, et cetera. But we also tracked the labor market, which was being ignored. And we also tracked inflation, which wasn't getting enough attention. And what we did that was really the breakthrough for us is we are the only people in the world outside China's central bank who track the credit market. And we're not just tracking what's happening at banks. We're tracking what's happening inside China's shadow banks. So we asked these thousands of firms how much they're borrowing, what they're borrowing for, how much they're paying, and we can track China's growth and predict China's growth using credit as a lens. It's a very, very powerful tool for us.
Well, I get all that. But what I don't get is why anybody's actually talking to you. Do they not have the fear of Big Brother?
Well, we don't operate on the ground as China Beige Book. That's one thing. So
okay.
we do
now
have
talking.
we do have a special sauce that keeps us as under the radar as possible. But look, when you're doing the only large-scale private data in the world in the Chinese economy, and you're reporting like we are right now, that growth is actually much weaker than what Beijing is claiming, then you have a spotlight on you. You have a target on you. And the question, obviously, is why are we allowed to do what we do? And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that no one in Beijing, no one in China likes the idea of us talking to newspapers and talking to people like yourselves and saying Chinese economic data is fake and the economic narrative is fake, and they manipulate their numbers when they don't like them. That's not very popular in China. But what they found over time is that there is an enormous concern over where China's going and what China's hiding. And so a handful of times over the past decade, when markets have really gotten panicky about what's happening in China and capital starts flowing out of there, usually illegally, and markets start crashing. August 2015 was the most obvious example of this, but we saw it in 2016, we saw it in 2013. What were we doing at the time? We reported back to our clients, made sure they knew what was going on, and then we went public with the idea that, look, this may look like a hard landing to you, but we've got data in front of us, and things are not nearly as bad as you think. A hard landing, as being described, in these scare pieces in the press, are not happening. Here's our data. Here's what it says. And this is why you have to worry about this and why you don't have to worry about that. And over time, what we were told, at least informally, from the Chinese government, is that we don't like what you say a lot of the time, but you have proven yourself over time to not have a greater agenda. You're not a bear. You're not someone talking their book. You're not someone out to get China. What you're doing is you're calling balls and strikes. And a lot of times that means calling China out for having juiced up data. And occasionally it means calming markets who were too panicky about something that's actually not happening inside the economy.
That must make you really popular with people who are talking their books. The word talking their books is we're talking about people who go on Bubble Vision and take one side or another of any given potential profit-making idea, trade idea. Well,
it's a major problem with not just the China watching industry, but finance writ large. I mean, how many people do you see out there on TV talking idea, and you find out why are they telling people that? Because they've got their money in it. They have no credibility. So one of the reasons we're different than these other entities that are out there commenting on the Chinese economy is that we don't have a stake in anything except getting it right. If we get it right, we'll have a flourishing company. If we get it wrong, we'll lose all our clients. You compare that to what happens at the investment banks right now. They have a million different agenda items, and getting the data right is about 900th on the list. Closer to the top would be getting more asset management business from China, getting more underwriting deals from China, making sure that they're getting 100% of their securities ventures granted permission for 100% security ventures that they're trying to establish on the mainland. They've got a lot of business opportunities, which incentivize them to not just tamp down the message, but sometimes to completely silence people within their ranks who have an alternative message, which is maybe China's not doing as good a job. Maybe Beijing is not orchestrating this magical economic movement that they're claiming. And one of the problems is that almost everybody who's got a finger in this China pie is talking their book, has something to be gained by their own theme. And that's something we've tried very, very hard to stay away from.
So how open is China to foreign investment? How open is China to companies who to U.S. companies that want to come in and set up shop? How successful has corporate America and Wall Street and the U.S. banking system, how successful have they been at making inroads on the mainland?
I'd say very unsuccessful. There have been success stories, and there will continue to be success stories. China has enormous opportunities out there because of the size of the economy, so you will see firms doing really well. But I think that if you had to grade the overall effort, the grade would be very, very low, simply because China made a lot of promises back in the early 2000s when there was the WTO accession, and we are going to open our economy. We're going to do this. Decades passed, and nothing had happened. Now, you've seen a lot of headlines recently about China opening its economy to banks or credit card companies or insurance firms, and that's wonderful, but it's also too late. They're competing against ensconced entities, Chinese champions, who are already in there. U.S. banks are not going to go into China and take business away and materially away from Chinese banks. You're not going to see MasterCard and Visa and American Express go into China and take business away from these ensconced Chinese e-commerce champions. So China waited and it dillied and it dallied, and now it's slowly opening up because it needs the capital. It's being pressured on the trade side, and that's all great. But the real opportunity to have gone in and competed, it's gone. So you will see success stories, but overall, this is dragged out for too long, and now foreign companies are the losers in this, and I don't think there's anything you can do about it.
Yeah, I think I heard some anecdote about Alibaba and the size of their footprint when it comes to transactions. I don't know how you would get something like that unentrenched, if you will.
Yeah, it's impossible to compete with a company like Alibaba, who on the one hand, extremely innovative, extremely talented workforce. It's a great company, but Beijing also has its back. And when you have those two things together, it's just impossible to compete with. And that's the problems foreign corporates have had in China for years and years.
So what do you say to people who say that China's built up so much debt that it is an accident waiting to happen? It's an economy that's going to implode under its own weight. There's no such thing as a scenario that can be painted for there not to be a hard landing. I mean, I hear it all the time.
Not only do I not think that a hard landing is inevitable, I don't even think it's likely. And let me explain why. Hard landing, first of all, has taken on many, many different connotations over the years. So back when China was growing at 8% a year, there were people out there who said if China's growth falls to 6% or so, that's a hard landing. So one of the ways that people have gotten away with having wrong predictions for years and years and years has been you just change the goal, you move the goalpost back. So it's a growth number. The way that I look at hard landing is I look at sort of an implosion, an acute crisis in China. And I don't think that is likely. What's happening right now is an enormous problem with bad debt. The debt that is recognized as non-performing by Beijing is a fraction of what's actually non-performing. Non-performing loans, the technical term, there's a multi-tier classification system, and when the bad debt gets too high in one category, they sort of just push it down and lower the non-performing loan numbers. So they're 2%. A lot of people think that they're over 20%. So there's no question. Nobody contests the idea that China has way too much bad debt, and that this is causing a severe problem and a severe challenge to China's economic model. The question is, what's going to happen next? And what I think most people miss in this is that China does not have a commercial financial system. A lot of people looked at what happened to the United States in 2008 and Europe slightly after and saw the economy sort of implode because parties stopped loaning to each other. You had a liquidity crisis. You had all these things happen because these Western banking systems were commercial financial systems. And what you have in China is something different. The state controls all the counterparties. And so what happens when you have a problem in China is you have one side of the state apparatus just swoosh a tidal wave of capital from one side, whether it's from this fund or from this bank, to plug a hole on that side. And then one side swoosh capital to the other side to constantly plug holes. Now what happens there is you fix the short-term problem, but you're constantly pushing bad money after good. And you're constantly creating less return on investment, less productivity. So potential growth rates will never outpace the growth of debt. And that's a very technical way of saying that the more China just takes all its big ball of cash it's kept hoarded and sort of throws at its problems one by one, it can deal with problems in the short term. It can deal with them much better than a Western economy, for instance. But the problem is over time, it's chased all their good money's chasing bad. They've got a system that's slowed down, it's stagnated. And I think that's the future of China. You've got a stagnated economy that's growing at 1% going forward. And that's a real structural problem. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing so much hesitancy on going big right now in China, despite the closing economy, is that Beijing understands, even if Western economists don't understand, that the debt problem is so severe that if they don't reverse some of this, or at least slow it down, then they're going to be in enormous trouble going forward with an economy that's just standing still in just a number of years.
So China has been, I mean, maybe we cannot necessarily see true Chinese data from Chinese authorities, but we can see with our own eyes the effect that Chinese growth has had on the rest of the world. So what are the implications for what you're describing, Leland? I mean, you're talking about this. This is going to affect continents. I mean, who will this hurt the most? And I mean, you can't. A day doesn't go by when you don't hear about Dr. Copper and copper prices going up so much and steel prices going up so much. There's this ongoing embedded assumption that China's always going to be driving the commodities complex. So but what you're talking about, sclerosis, stagnation, these are not exactly dynamic adjectives to describe a country that's going to continue to be the consumer of first and last resort.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, the people that are at the most risk here aren't even in China, because China's got some structural questions it has to answer, and it's going to have to deal with slower growth, either because it restructures its economy towards slower, healthier growth that's less debt fueled, that's more based on consumption and less the state sector sucking the private sector out of existence. If it does it right, that's what happens. If it doesn't, then this goes until you have more of a problem and you start seeing a dramatic slowdown, and all the loans in the world into the Chinese economy don't make Chinese firms want to borrow because they see an uncertain future. They don't like what's ahead of them, and you're going to see a substantial growth slide in China no matter what. The best case scenario, the worst case scenario. But China can get out the other side in one piece and become an emerging power. This isn't the end of China. This is a major metamorphosis of China. The countries that are in real trouble here are the ones that have been looking to the Chinese economy as this demand center that will keep their economies going indefinitely. Now, you mentioned commodities producers. These are the worst of the bunch. You look at all these economies out there that have been, instead of diversifying themselves away from commodities, just cranking out stuff they can ship to China. What they've been doing is just relying on this growth, relying on Chinese promises that this will continue indefinitely, and they haven't done enough structural changes to their own economy. So as Chinese demand falls over the course of the coming years and decades, you're going to have a real problem in all these places that have relied on Chinese demand and Chinese consumption. And it's just now occurring to some of these countries that they have to do something about it, and we're going to see if it's too late. But this is the real problem. This belief in 8% forever, which the Chinese pushed as this party slogan, was taken way too seriously by the whole world for way too long. And now you're going to have severe dislocations as a result of this over the coming years.
So what would the top 5 most affected economies be? I mean, I spent 10 days in Australia recently. I can tell you there's made in China's everywhere there, whether you're talking about real estate or their biggest port.
Right. Well, Australia's on the list. We talk about South Africa. We talk about Brazil. There's actually quite a few South American countries that might be on that list. If they're cranking out a lot of producing a lot of commodities and a lot of it shipping to China, then that's a real problem. And right now there's so much fear about growth that the Chinese may actually be backing into their old playbook of using some heavy property growth in order to get the growth numbers up. So this may be sending some false signals to people out there that, hey, maybe this model's not dead. The model's dead. They may they're just trying to squeeze a little bit more out of it before it suffocates.
So as an economic historian, I can tell you the only time in the past 100 years that you've seen a commodity super cycle like we had seen before come to a screeching halt and stay low for longer than anybody was anticipating was during the Great Depression. That's the only time we've seen that.
Well, we're going to see that to some degree going forward. It's just a question of how much longer China wants to push growth higher at the expense of its future. And that's a decision made in Beijing, but it's a decision that we track with our data and try to make sure we're understanding the types of policy calls they're making as they make them.
So I've written in the past the term quiet colonizer. Carmen Reinhart has written extensively about this. How has China expanded its presence globally? What mechanism has it used, especially in Africa?
Well, one of the major foreign policy tools the Chinese Communist Party has is to loan money out to firms around the globe and then use that as leverage for either foreign policy or economic reasons. A lot of these deals are not done above the table. there was an enormous push into Africa in order to secure agricultural lands and other and commodities and other things that the Chinese economy needed in order to keep it going. This is something that scared everybody for a long time, but we're also seeing the problems the Chinese are encountering because of this. So they're deep into Central Asia, they're deep into South Asia and Africa and elsewhere. And Chinese money is out there pushing policy. But at the same time, quite a lot of this money will never get pushed back, will never get paid back. You've also got a situation where when the Chinese do business abroad, they don't just hand out money, they send Chinese workers. They like to keep some of these workers employed. And there have been enormous hostilities in Africa and Central Asia, elsewhere. Some of this related to the One Belt, One Road program, where instead of these countries think that they're taking money in and they're going to be able to use them for employment and all these other wonderful reasons. But the next thing they see is tens of thousands of Chinese come in and they're setting up shop and temporary barracks and they're doing the work. So none of this is as clear cut as I think a lot of people thought. A few years ago, there was a huge fear that China was taking over the world through this. And I think now there's much more of a fear that China has thrown their money around. They're never going to get it back. And they've made quite a few enemies along the way. So it's a mixed bag, but it's much more of a mixed bag than people understood at the time when everyone was scared to death of what China was doing.
Well, a lot of these countries you're talking about are taking money right now from the International Monetary Fund, and in a million years, well, that's an exaggeration, but in a very long time, will not have the wherewithal to pay back what they owe China. So there was a time not too long ago that China had $4 trillion in foreign reserves. First of all, can you explain what that concept means in layman's terms? And it's come down to $3 trillion, but is that a real number?
It's not a real number, but it's a number that markets look at, policymakers look at. So we take seriously. It is a real number, but it's not the number. Let me rephrase. What I mean by that is so when China has a non-convertible currency, you can't just take the yuan and exchange it however you want. When dollars go into the Chinese economy, they're exchanged for yuan. Those dollars.
When China sells something into the United States and it's paid for in dollars.
Right. And as those dollars go to Chinese companies, they exchange them for yuan on the mainland. They're required to. And so what basically happens is that the Chinese government has an enormous storage of this Forex reserves. Now, it's not a piggy bank. It's marked against actual obligations at these Chinese companies. But it means that there's a huge Forex reserve of US dollars, mostly US dollars, that are there in order to sort of backstop the obligations on the yuan. And back a few years ago, earlier in Xi Jinping's tenure, you saw the Chinese numbers cross 4 trillion in Forex reserves and $4 trillion. And the big worry in Beijing was that the number was getting so big, they were going to have to find reasons to recycle this money into the global economy, or else they were going to start having political problems with folks around the world for trade reasons and for other reasons. This was going to become a political issue because the Forex reserves were too high. So that's when Belt and Road started getting a lot of steam. That's when a lot of these other programs started getting a lot of steam. But what happened in the time since? They had a Forex crisis. That there was some panics. 2016, the number dropped to 3 trillion-ish. And in fairness to the Chinese, that number is not the number people should be looking at. There's far more capital within the banking system that China could draw on if there was ever a true capital outflow crisis. So the Forex number is important. It's not the only number we should be looking at. And what happened in 2016, I think, was oversold to a great degree, which is why you never saw the devaluation of the currency that everyone predicted. But I think that the number does have import, because when you got down to 3 trillion, all of a sudden you went from the world saying China's got way too much is a problem, saying, wait a second, China's got a whole lot of obligations and a whole lot of debt. Is 3 trillion enough? And then you started to have worries about the solvency and the workability of the Chinese economic model. And so now you're in a position where Xi Jinping has already backed One Belt, One Road. Although they're pulling it back, his fingerprints are on that. So you can't just make this thing go away. But they don't have the type of capital they need in order to put all these global programs into fruition, whether it's Central Asia, again, whether it's Africa, whether it's South America, whether it's somewhere else. So they're in a very difficult jam, whereas they don't have the type of financial firepower to be able to keep these programs going the way they intended them back in 2013 or 2014. And it's a rhetorical problem for the party, but it's also an economic management issue for the party right now. So they're trying to figure out how they continue to talk big about their outward push,
right,
during a time where the Chinese economy more and more needs to pull in capital in order to be able to function.
Well, we know that they've got something on their hands, rare earth metals. First of all, let's just say, for example, that people don't know what rare earth metals are, but they've become pretty important. And help us understand why rare earth metals have become so important and what the implications are for countries outside of China.
Well, rare earth metals are what they sound like. They're certain elements that are only available in certain places around the globe. China has an enormous stock of them. They're not available mostly outside of China, with a handful of exceptions. And these are the types of things that will go into electric vehicle batteries and very, very important new age technology. And what happened a number of years ago is that China was making some international plays to secure even more of these rare earth metals to get it basically a monopoly on it. And people started sniffing around saying, well, what's going on here? This is a real supply chain vulnerability. Pretty much the origin of the worries on supply chains came from the rare earth metals a number of years ago. And you started seeing this become a big policy issue in Japan and the United States, saying, wait a second, we can't let China create this chokehold on these important rare earth elements, or they're going to have this ability to shut down foreign production. And this is when people's eyes started to get opened up, that by allowing the Chinese to have choke points in the supply chain, in this case, rare earth metals, you could be endangering part of your own economy. You could be endangering some of your next generation sectors. And this is where people started getting smart on it. And now we're looking at this. It would be an enormous problem for China if it actually cut this off. This is an act of economic warfare to cut out these components from the Japanese, from the Americans, from elsewhere. But the problem is right now, China has less leverage than it would like over a lot of its trading partners. So things that a couple of years ago would have seemed outlandish to consider, why would China ever consider doing that? All of these things are now possible. And it's why policymakers in particular are starting to sort of reevaluate where these vulnerabilities are in the supply chain. And supply chain issues have gone from an afterthought at corporates, an afterthought in Congress, to being one of the most pressing issues of the year for 2020.
Well, look, the conversation that we just had, the explanation that you just gave could just as easily have been applicable to the pharmaceuticals industry in a post-COVID world. I mean, do you see concerted efforts in Congress, inside the Beltway, in Washington, D.C., to make sure that we in the future, because I know a lot of Americans are very focused on this, that we never let this happen again, so to speak?
On Pharma, yes. We work with a lot of companies, and what's important to understand these supply chain issues, the supply chain problems and the supply chain responses that corporates have, it's not monolithic. So you have some companies like pharmaceuticals, which are going to be have heavy government oversight. There's a national security component, as we've seen, because of COVID. And there is going to be a push from politicians to solve this. You're going to see other types of companies, whether it's car companies, whether it's IT companies with parts vulnerability, they're working to try to untangle themselves from these supply chains, but there's less of an urgency. There are less options because they don't have these type of production options outside of China quite yet. So there's no supply chain solution, but there is a realization across corporate America and global corporates that something has to be done. And the old way was, how do we get things as cheap as possible in order to make the share price go up? And now people are realizing, whether it's because of the trade war or geopolitical tensions or COVID-19, that it's no longer acceptable to tell shareholders you don't have a plan B or a plan C. So now every corporate is being forced to go to a war room and think, how do we create fewer vulnerabilities in our supply chains? This is a process that's happening everywhere. We're involved with a lot of companies doing this, but I think pharma that you brought up was in particular, that's in the government crosshairs. There's been an executive order drafted on this. It's sort of sitting on Trump's desk, waiting for him to sort of push this forward. But this is political issue, major political issue. Some of the other supply chain issues aren't quite as political, but wow, this is something that's absolutely taking up bandwidth on Capitol Hill and in the White House right now.
Speaking of bandwidth on Capitol Hill, so Hong Kong, it's a huge subject. We've seen night after night of footage, and then COVID came and that seemed to have tamped down, but boy, is it ramped back up again. First of all, at the most basic level, Hong Kong was handed back from the British a few years back, 1997, I think, you can correct me. What role has it played in the mainland's economy since then? Because you look at per capita growth in Hong Kong, you look at per capita growth on the mainland, and they're right there on top of each other, obviously, and they're day and night. What role has Hong Kong played?
Well, in some ways, it played this bridge between China and the West, because it allowed China to be capitalist and free market-ish and Western, but not have to change the mainland economy, not have to make a political call on this. They simply accepted what was handed to them and allowed Hong Kong to play this pivotal role as this Asia, the centerpiece of Asian commerce. And you had Western bankers interacting with Chinese bankers, and it was had this really unique role because it was part of China, but it was part of the West. And what you've seen over the course of the past 6 weeks or so has been the end of that. The end of Hong Kong as we know it. The Chinese ripped back their promise of one country, two systems. And when they did this, the political choice for the United States was, do we treat Hong Kong the way it was, or do we treat it as just another Chinese province? And I think that there was a lot of wait and see within the White House on how do we move forward with this. But when the actual national security law was written in Beijing, and people saw what it said, and it allowed, it was so much more draconian than anyone thought. It allows Secret Service to operate all throughout China. It allows people to be extradited back to Beijing. It has an extraterritoriality clause, which allows the Chinese to arrest anyone doing anything in the entire world outside of Hong Kong or outside of China that's doing anything counter to the Hong Kong system, to the Chinese Communist Party's belief in how Hong Kong should run. So this was a absolute worst case scenario for the law. It was way worse than anyone I know had predicted it. And as a result, the U.S. in the last several weeks has moved forward to treat Hong Kong again like China. They're getting their tariff privileges revoked. So now tariffs are going to be applied to Hong Kong the same way they are mainland China. Export controls have been pulled back. And the sad part of this is this vibrant Hong Kong democracy, this vibrant Hong Kong economy is gone. It will never be this way again. And
but you described something that is akin to China shooting itself in the foot. Why did China? You would think that this would have been world's most convenient conduit. Why was China so dead set on pushing forward with this if Hong Kong provided such a vital financial intermediary role to the mainland, especially now when you think about the Chinese economy as being, as you describe, in a fairly vulnerable position?
Right. I think the answer to that is because China, Beijing, thought it was losing Hong Kong. And you had a calendar that's very specific to Hong Kong on this. People look at what's happening in Hong Kong, the tragedy of Hong Kong right now, and they sort of want to place this in the U.S.-China tension battle. They want to see this as some sort of big chess piece in the global, the global competition between the West and China. Sure, it plays that role. But what actually was happening in Hong Kong was you had some elections that were scheduled for September. And there was a very small window for Beijing to step in and change the political rules. Otherwise, what was going to happen in September was going to be what happened in the previous election, which was all the pro-Beijing forces were going to get routed. And when Beijing looked at this, they said, wow, we are going to get enormous blowback from changing the rules in Hong Kong. We know it. But if we let this happen and we let Hong Kong basically toss out its pro-Beijing forces, you might have an even bigger problem down the road. And I think with the political problems that Xi Jinping has had at home, with looking about at Taiwan, and with basically the trade war, Xi Jinping has had a very bad last couple of years. And when he looked at Hong Kong, I think the decision was made that this is gonna be painful. But if we don't do this now, we may have to do something far, far, far worse later. And that's why the decision was made to push upon Hong Kong a national security law that now criminalizes anything that Beijing doesn't like.
So this is strong arming as opposed to sending troops in the streets.
Right, and you know, the issue was always that Beijing was never going to have a Tiananmen-like charge into Hong Kong, simply because it owned Hong Kong beforehand. It has prepared for this for 20, 30 years. You would just have people sucked off the street and arrested, and this is a very difficult time. It was a very difficult decision for Beijing to make, but it wasn't one between a full-on crackdown at this point and a political crackdown. But I think that what was going through their heads in Beijing was, we can't lose Hong Kong anymore, because if it's any further out of our orbit, if it flies any further out of our orbit, then we may actually have to bring in the guns. And that's why they moved.
There's a lot of talk about the dollar peg. First of all, what is a dollar peg, just in case people don't know? And what is the future of the Hong Kong dollar peg?
Well, the question, first of all, a dollar peg is when a currency decides, within a band or a particular number, typically within a band, decides to say, we are going to be X amount of Hong Kong dollars to the US dollar, or this X amount of Chinese yuan to the US dollar. And we're going to allow our central bank to keep it within that band. The market can move within a small band, but we're going to keep this thing locked in a pretty tight band. And because we like the stability of the US dollar, we want to ground everything we're doing in the fact the US dollar is this global reserve currency, and we want to pile on that stability for our own purposes. Now, when people talk about the Hong Kong dollar peg collapsing, either because the US takes it down, which I can tell you is not being considered right now, or because the Chinese do something to cause some sort of problems that snowball into this becoming a political weapon, you have to ask yourself, who will this benefit? Who will be punished and who will benefit? I don't think there's anyone out there who's going to do terribly well, other than a few hedge funds, if the Hong Kong dollar peg would go kaplooey. So it's not in China's interest right now. It's not in Hong Kong's interest. It's not in the US interest. So when people talk about taking down this Hong Kong peg, I try to push them back on this. It doesn't serve a purpose. It wouldn't serve a purpose. And so let's hold our horses on thinking that this is part of the financial warfare that we would be considering.
Well, so talk us about what economic warfare is going on right now, and what China's doing right now to maintain its position on the global stage. And I mean specifically vis-a-vis the United States.
Well, we're not yet at a position where economic warfare is being utilized between the two countries, but it's being threatened, and that's why this is very different than the last few years. So one of the most obvious examples of this is banking sanctions. So the new legislation that Congress passed in a bipartisan fashion and that President Trump signed has the potential for individuals who are designated as being troublemakers in Hong Kong because they are furthering the crackdown or doing something to dissidents. Not only are they being targeted, but any banks that work with those individuals will be targeted. Now, the administration stepped in and made these things discretionary rather than mandatory, because they didn't want to get sucked down an alley where all of a sudden things are escalating out of their control. So banking sanctions would be one major way for the US and China to ratchet up tensions enormously. And markets, of course, would take notice of this. You have anything involved with US dollar. So right now, the US dollar is provided to Hong Kong, the Hong Kong dollar peg. I just said that it's very, very unlikely they would toy around with the Hong Kong dollar peg, but providing dollars to Hong Kong, providing dollars to Chinese entities, very, very important. And so when we talk about red lines and what the red line of the red lines are and what the biggest, baddest red lines are, really the one that would really shake Beijing, it would be tantamount to an act of war, would be cutting off important Beijing institutions, entities, possibly even individuals from the US dollar system. We talk about that through SWIFT, which is the sort of international payment mechanism for doing this. But any type of utilization of the dollar as an economic weapon will shift what's going on right now from sort of a tit-tat, back and forth scrum between the U.S. and China to something that would be elevated to the point where you'd start to have to worry about guns shooting at each other.
So walk us through Huawei. You've got some pretty strong opinions about Huawei. It's not just another Chinese bad guy. Why have we been so focused on agriculture, to take one example? And why haven't we been more focused on Huawei? Why do we pay attention to TikTok? Walk me through this.
Well, if you look at the trade side, I don't want to relitigate the last couple of years, but essentially what we've done is prioritize above absolutely everything else the idea that we have to get our bilateral trade deficit down with China, meaning, they don't buy enough from us. We buy a lot from them. We need to make that more equal. Now, that sounds fine. Trade deficits overall are something worth watching. We should be trying to balance trade. Bilateral trade deficit is economic nonsense, because you're leaving out third parties that could be part of this. If we're selling something to Vietnam and Vietnam's selling something to China and China's selling us, right, then the other sides of the triangle are quite important too. But to sort of go big picture on this, we have decided that the trade numbers and the trade deficits and making a more fair trade playing field has been the most important priority for U.S.-China policy for the past couple of years. And it's what it has done is it's forced us to miss some of the bigger issues that are happening with the relationship. And you brought up Huawei. Huawei is a perfect example of this. When you talk about the U.S. system, the U.S. model of innovation and markets, and that is a really dynamic system, and it's competing against the Chinese model, which is debt-fueled and centralized and authoritarian. 95 times out of 100, the U.S. in a clear playing field will outduel the Chinese model because it's not built on efficiency, it's not built on innovation. And when you have two countries competing on equal playground, then let them go. And that's why, in general, I'm against the idea of the big tariffs here, et cetera. The problem is that there are certain areas of the economy that don't play by those rules. Now, some may know them by Made in China 2025, which are certain sectors that China brought to all of our attention, saying these are advanced manufacturing sectors that are extremely important to us, and we want to rule the world in them going forward. And these are 5G, these are robotics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, these type of very important next generation technologies. Now, a lot of people say, well, wait a second, we've got great companies, they've got great companies, let's go at them. Let's just compete, may the best man win. Well, that's not what China's doing. What China's been doing is using companies like Huawei, like ZTE, as foreign policy tools and as heavily subsidized entities. So, for instance, when U.S. companies or Nokia and Ericsson, so these other foreign companies are doing 5G, are trying to develop technologies and develop products, they're out there essentially competing against a Chinese giant that has tens of billions of state subsidies behind it, and the arm of the state pushing Huawei into countries that are taking out, that are borrowing from China, that are allied with China, that want other favors from China. So Huawei is being pushed into these various markets. There's no way you can compete with certain types of companies, certain sectors of the economy, where Beijing has decided it is using its centralized power, harnessing its centralized power to be global champions. So if 95% of the time US model squares up against the Chinese model, the US model will do fine. It will probably win. But when China has decided it's going to take a handful of companies or a handful of sectors and make them global champions, and these are going to be the type of companies that are going to run the global architecture, telecommunications architecture, cryptological architecture, artificial intelligence, every part of the next wave, the next future.
It's like the future of innovation in the world. This is the next generation of economic growth.
Exactly. So this falls outside the bucket of two nations competing. China has decided it's going to make its champions the global winners. Then you really need a more concerted public sector, private sector combined response to push back against them. And look, this is even leaving out the fact that Huawei and ZTE and others have been longtime violators of U.S. sanctions on Iran and North Korea. You've seen enormous amounts of intellectual property theft. The DOJ, Department of Justice, right now has a huge investigation going on and sort of documenting all the things Huawei's done over the years. So Huawei is not just another Chinese company that we need to keep an eye on. It's sort of the vanguard of this 5G push, the vanguard, sort of the symbolic leader of this Made in China 2025 movement. And it deserves much more attention from policymakers than it's getting right now. So this is something that I think that people were very late to wake up to, but now Congress is on it, the administration's on it, and Huawei is going to find it a lot more difficult to compete when it's not having its way cleared by the Chinese government with no opposition.
Well, it seems like some of our allies might be coming in line with this. I mean, you've heard from the British that I think, if I'm not wrong, I think that the British are going to start to move away from. Do you think that that is something that could continue in the coming years with our allies?
It will, if we give our allies the reason to do that. I mean, one of the reasons that we've had that we haven't had a united front on this is because while we're telling them to ally themselves with us on Huawei, we're threatening them with auto tariffs through the back door. So there has to be more of a unified foreign policy, economic policy, trade policy platform to say, look, what do we want done here? What's the priority? Is it China or is it car tariffs in Germany? And if you come to the conclusion that we need to sort of utilize our long-standing alliances in order to hold China accountable for the type of model it has, which is heavily, state sector subsidized, and all these other unfair parts of the economic model that have caused havoc across the global economy. You have to have a foreign policy position that unites your allies on this, and I think that's what the Trump administration just has left us hanging on. And I think that needs to get more attention in the coming years.
So I saw a headline a few days ago that China had made a secret pact with Iran for 25 years in this on the security front. Was that? Please tell me that was fake news.
Look, I assume it's real. If what Beijing has realizing belatedly right now is its behavior, bullying the whole world, has not left it with a lot of true friends. And so when it looks around the world, well, who would rather be on our side than America's? Granted, you're seeing a lot more hemming and hawing than you saw a few years ago. But right now, Iran's country number one. So I think what you're going to see is Beijing grab at anybody and everybody who wants to push back against U.S. leadership and make a big stink about it. So is this good news? No, those guys are up to no good. But at the same time, I don't think it's surprising. Iran is in our crosshairs for certain issues, and Beijing's in our crosshairs for certain other issues. It makes a lot of sense for them to work together to try to frustrate what we want to get done.
What about Russia? They kind of share a pretty large border. What role will Russia play in alliances theoretically in the future?
Eternal troublemaker. Russia's in a difficult position because it's a power with a lot of oil. It's not really a great power, but has a nice petrochemical sector and a nice military industrial complex, and likes to cause trouble around the globe. But it has a problem. It's obviously not looking to help America out, but it has a long border with China, and it has enormous problems with Beijing and on that border, and so Russia's in a difficult situation, and I think that rather than a grand player in all of this, it's really just an eternal troublemaker that we need to sort of make sure we're not empowering, but they don't fall into the same bucket as China or Iran or others that could really cause us some serious near-term damage.
Taiwan, big subject. How committed is the United States? Where will Taiwan be in 50 years? What's your view?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. In previous administrations, it was very clear. Congress supported Taiwan, and usually administrations had very strong political relationships with Taiwan policymakers, because these are things that have been nurtured over the course of many years. And so, up until a couple of years ago, I would have been very confident that if push came to shove, the Taiwan Relations Act, which was written a bit ambiguously, but is essentially interpreted as this requirement for the United States to provide not just defense materials, but some form of defense for Taiwan, but very ambiguous, would be held up, and an American president would say, China, don't you dare, we're going to step in here, and this is a vibrant democracy, it's not China, and don't move any further. We don't know what Trump feels about this. I mean, I think we do know, and I think he sees this as a pawn in this grand game. It's very dangerous for Taiwan right now. So a lot of Taiwan's in an awful position. It's caught between the tug and the push and pull of two enormous great powers that both have their own designs on it, but both have bigger issues to deal with. China views Taiwan as a renegade province. It is China. That is the Chinese position. We're not going to convince Beijing of anything otherwise. At the same time, we have legislative and political commitments to Taiwan to defend it. And so this ambiguity has served very, very well in the past, particularly when the US military was so much more powerful than the Chinese military that there wasn't really a question of how a skirmish would end up. Not so much anymore. So with the rising U.S.-China tensions, with Taiwan being sort of pulled from each side, with the Chinese military on the rise, particularly in the Pacific region, this gets a lot hairier. So
before we move on to the South China Sea in our tour of the world, semiconductors in Taiwan, there's a very practical reason that China wants to keep such a stronghold as well. What is that relationship?
Yeah, so one of the reasons Taiwan's being talked about now, where it hasn't really gotten that much press in terms of, will Beijing invade or blockade it? Part of this is because when one country, two systems fell in Hong Kong, it basically destroyed the model that China had been promising Taiwan if it just came back under the fold. Hey, look, we'll let you be, just trust us. And now Hong Kong has shown that model doesn't work. And so there is no longer a workable model for Taiwan to look at. They are an independent country, or they will be a conquered Chinese province. There's really no in between anymore. So that was a serious change in the way that I think the Taiwanese have looked at their future. But like you said, semiconductors are another piece of the puzzle. The most important semiconductor company in the world right now is probably Taiwan Semiconductor. They make all the chips that Huawei and others use in all their devices worldwide. So yes, in their phones, but the real ones that are important are in 5G base stations. Without Taiwan Semi providing those chips, and they're very advanced chips, they're ones that the Chinese domestic industry cannot make at this point and will not be able to make anytime soon. Without providing these chips, Huawei as a company could die. And so there is an enormous stranglehold that Taiwan Semiconductor has over a critical Chinese company, and actually the entire 5G effort, which is important component of Xi Jinping's economic policy. So you've got this enormous position of power for Taiwan Semiconductor, which of course the U.S. side has said, hey, we know what you can do. You can go build a factory in Arizona, which they're trying to move some of the production onto to U.S. land in order to tighten the relationship.
Would China let that happen?
Well, it's already been announced. They haven't actually done anything. China can't stop them from doing that, but it can start pushing Taiwan and other aspects of the relationship. But they've got another problem here. So the Department of Commerce, a year ago, Huawei went on the entity list, and everyone said, wow, that sounds like such a tough thing. That must really shut down Huawei. Huawei had record revenues that year anyways. Didn't do a thing. You know, we've been talking about this. The entity list is not something that stops production for Huawei. It didn't do anything to Huawei. But what the Department of Commerce has done in the last couple, U.S. Department of Commerce has done in the last couple of months has been something more advanced. And they came out with something called the Foreign Product Rule, which requires any chip producer that uses U.S. inputs, and that importantly includes Taiwan Semiconductor, must file for a license from the U.S. Department of Commerce in order to provide it to Huawei or several other entities. So right now, unless the Department of Commerce gives Taiwan Semiconductor a license to operate with Huawei, the U.S. Department of Commerce can put a stranglehold on Taiwan Semiconductor, which could put a stranglehold on Huawei and end them. Now, if this sounds as dangerous as it does, it is. It really is. Now, the question is, does Donald Trump want to go there? Will they actually shut down Huawei as a company with all the secondary implications that would have on the relationship and on the end of the trade deal and other things? They're not there yet. But I think what Huawei is now looking at, and the Chinese government is now looking at, is this enormous stranglehold that the US government has on certain of its champions, and the enormous stranglehold that Taiwan Semiconductor in particular has on a couple of its champions. And this only confuses and makes more difficult any predictions on Taiwan, because now everybody's in a real dangerous bubble here, and we don't know how it's going to end up.
So now we can go to the South China Sea and the U.S. Navy, and what has happened. If you look back at the Obama administration, I think that that on the world stage, it was determined that the build out in the South China Sea was in violation of international law, but it was nobody ever did anything about it. It's continued, from what I understand. Walk us through what their military presence is. I mean, when we were speaking offline before the interview, you mentioned the word missiles. What is happening there? What are we doing there? And what is the potential?
Well, until recently, we were doing almost nothing. And that's under Obama, that's under Trump. And one of the reasons why what's happening on the ground right now has become a reality. The Chinese are ensconced there. They are not going to be able to be pulled out of those positions. We have a new reality in the South China Sea. But I think that there's two different issues when we talk about South China Sea. The first one is China's militarizing some of their islands. And they've also created little rocks in the middle of nowhere and claimed EEZs off of them. And the problem here is that in the South China Sea, you've got a bunch of islands. And typically, and this gets a little bit wonky when you're talking to, law of the sea, a possession, whether it's Vietnamese or Chinese or Malaysian or any other, is granted 200 miles around it. It's called an EEZ, an economic exclusion zone, where that country has sovereignty in that area. And a lot of these EEZs overlap with each other because you've got a lot of rocks in the South China Sea. So there's a lot of adjudications that need to be happening. China has basically decided that there's something called the 9-dash line, which is a map it made up one day, which just encompasses the whole South China Sea. And they said, hey, that's ours. Where'd you get this map? Oh, it's been around for like 1,000 years. Ooh, where'd you get it from? It's been around for 1,000 years. Just trust us. There's this thing called the 9-dash line. This is our stuff. And so they are saying that all these EEZs from the Philippines and from Vietnam and from all these other countries, Taiwan, are actually Chinese waters. So stay out of them. They've also been militarizing certain rocks, which are literally just rocks that they're building up with sand and bringing construction crews in and creating man-made islands. Then they're putting a person and a missile on top of them and saying, hey, this is Chinese land, stay away. Now, what has been happening here, South China Sea has been totally ignored for the last 3 years because, of course, we had to worry about soybeans. But the reason it's becoming back into this is that people are realizing that South China Sea is not about the US-China policy battle. It's not even about whether Vietnam or whether the Philippines or whether Taiwan gets control of any particular island. It's all about freedom of navigation. The US interest in this has always been that we will use our Navy to ensure that all these international waters will be free for commerce. South China Sea is one of the largest gateways for commerce in the entire world. And we will keep that free. And the principle of freedom of navigation and open commerce is something that is absolutely up in tier 1 priorities as a national security interest of the United States. Not whether the Vietnamese get an island, not whether the Chinese get another island, but freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, like everywhere else in the world, is absolutely critical to U.S. security. And what's happening, all these Chinese pushes and refusals to adhere to international rulings have caused there to be a real question to whether the Chinese think that they can block off this area from commerce, including the United States, U.S. ships, U.S. military, et cetera. People have not wanted to deal with this for a while. I think the Chinese have been very content to just establish their reality on the ground for years. Why get in a fight now when we can just keep building up these islands and putting missiles on it? U.S. presidents have refused to do anything about it except the occasional sail through. Well, now I think we're realizing that this is a real problem. And so going forward, this is not just about defending an ally or taking a smaller country's side against a bigger ally or a bigger country like China that's bullying them. This is about freedom of navigation. And it's why the South China Sea is such an enormous geopolitical risk. Because if the Chinese decide to block off any of these channels, the U.S. military has to run the blockade. It has to, even if that brings us to war. And the Chinese know that, but here we are, and things are a lot more dangerous in 2020.
Well, so I'm gonna hop on my Twitter feed for just a second. Anytime any little thing happens with China, and these discussions come up, the immediate reply is, well, the U.S. is going to lose its reserve currency status. How feasible is that? Even if something was to come to pass, how feasible is it that there's this deeply held conviction that because the United States continues to run up its debts, because we rely on 36% of our outstanding treasuries are owned by foreigners, can we lose this reserve currency status?
That's nonsense. It's nonsense. Not that we cannot.
Few enemies.
Look, I get tomatoes thrown at me for this one, but look, yes, I can think of a scenario where the U.S. loses its reserve currency status, but it's not because someone else takes it. There are no other contenders for reserve currency status right now. It's not the Chinese, who don't have a deep enough bond market, who don't have free convertibility. So the Chinese are not even sort of a contender and will never be anytime soon. They're going the other direction. Who's the other contenders? The euro, the yen. I'm not even talking about Bitcoin, too small. So when you talk about a global reserve currency, you have to have something that has all the advantages that the dollar brings, even if you have all this political uncertainty, which is starting to come along with it. So there is no next currency up to bat. The only way the U.S. loses reserve currency anytime in the near future is if the United States shoots itself in the foot and loses all its credibility. Now, yeah, your eyebrows are up because this has suddenly become a real possibility. Look, when we started talking about the aggregate,
we're printing a lot of money, Leland. We're running up. We're running up deficits, the likes of which we've never seen before, and we're headed into election. But go on. I
agree, but I don't think that they lose it because they print too much money. I'm not in favor of this. I'm scared out of my mind where we're going next. But everybody's printing a lot of money, and I think that the problem here is this: that when you start threatening U.S. Treasury abrogating, U.S. debt obligations to China, and you start saying, well, maybe the United States isn't going to pay back what it's owed. These are not really IOUs. This is an international, that's not how it works. But if you start talking about the fact that the United States will not honor its obligation as the lender of last resort and as the reserve currency, then all of a sudden you start bringing doubts into people's mind whether their investments in the U.S. dollar and in the American economy are good. And while there is no currency that can rip the global reserve currency, status away from the United States dollar, and there's no country that can do it. The United States could do some really, really, really stupid things, lose credibility. And I think in that case, rather than having another reserve currency jump up, you start breaking into regional blocks. It would become a very different world. But because there's not an heir apparent here, it's not going to happen anytime soon unless enormously stupid policy decisions are made, So stupid, in fact, that even when stupid policies have been discussed over the last 3 years, these were not one of them. So I'll tell you, there has to be next generation stupid for this to happen.
No, boy. Well, speaking of which, why don't we circle back to the Beltway? In just a few months, we have a presidential election. Do you see, because do you ever see China as not being a focal point in US policy circles, regardless of what the outcome of the election is? Let's say Biden wins. Do you ever see the United States stepping back, the unrealization of the importance of Huawei and the future of technology and the future of innovation? Will China remain on the front burner regardless of who's running Congress, regardless of who's in the White House?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something that's very well understood by both Biden and Trump. The election is going to be dictated in large part by what happens with COVID, of course. But beyond that, this is about China. And I think that the reason that Trump has not gone harder against China, now you're seeing an announcement every day looking like they're sort of turning up the temperature. Well, they haven't really done anything yet because the president wants to keep his phase one trade deal. When it becomes too difficult to keep a phase one trade deal, whether it's a day from now, a week from now, or a few months from now, president pulls back, you lose the trade deal, all of a sudden you can go much, much harder. And I think the last card that the president would want to play, if he didn't think he could run on economic leadership or a great recovery in the fall, will be, I'm the toughest guy on China, that's why you need to elect me. And right now, we're heading into a fall, which is probably going to be the worst relations that anyone's seen since Tiananmen, if not worse than that. Tiananmen Square in 1989, in other words. The crackdown there where things got really icy. We are heading into a really, really bad period in US-China relations. And one of the issues here is that the leverage points that the Americans have are far greater than anything the Chinese have, which makes the Chinese very nervous. And it's why when we talk about things like South China Sea or Taiwan, other things like that, these should not normally be brought up in a conversation, but if you lack leverage and you're trying to show that China will not be pushed around, some of the things that have been off the radar, but also off the list of possibilities for years and years and years are suddenly becoming possible right now. It's a very, very dangerous time. And the problem is no matter who wins, this is not going away. This is going to be the new great power competition going forward, and I don't think there's any reversing out of this.
So let's not go to COVID-19, and we'll end here because I think things have changed for China in a post-COVID world in terms of countries that would have never stood up to China that maybe now, because their economies have been so harmed by this virus, there were 116 other countries besides Australia that demanded an independent inquiry at the World Health Organization, for example. I think 12 months ago, we would have never seen such a showing. How badly has COVID harmed China's standing in the world because of what it's done to so many economies?
I think COVID has harmed China's standing. I think COVID has caused Beijing to do enormously stupid things that have badly, badly hurt China's standing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Obviously, having the coronavirus originate in Beijing has made a lot of people angry. The average person off the street is angry at China for having originated this.
Absolutely.
You've got that dynamic. But in addition, this has caused so much domestic angst, coming on top of the trade war, coming on top of the problems in Hong Kong, coming on top of all the other challenges with the slowing economy Beijing's dealing with right now, that they've sort of taken their playbook for the last couple of years in terms of being this goodwill international champion, and they haven't just dropped it or put it behind them. They've lit it on fire and thrown it out the window. All the goodwill that they were starting to build up when people were starting to get tired of Trump's take, and they were trying to capitalize that in international institutions. it's all gone because essentially China went after everybody. They put their wolf warriors on Twitter. They attacked Australia. They attacked Canada. They insulted France. They're attacking the UK. They attacked Africans in China have faced a very difficult time with racism. Look, it's basically gone down a very dark road. And when you look at that as an outsider, it's very difficult to figure out what they're talking about. All they needed to do is continue to smile, to say, we apologize, this came from us, but we are going to ship you ventilators, we're going to ship you masks, we are going to be your friend. We figured out how to beat it earlier than anybody else, we figured out how to contain it, and we're going to be the world leader on this. And I think had they kept that, particularly how poorly a lot of other countries, like the United States, are handling COVID, it would have been a very powerful message of goodwill that could have allowed them to escape this tunnel that they were digging themselves into. But apparently that's not what the political imperative was in Beijing. The political imperative in Beijing was we need to rally around the flag. We need to convince everybody that everyone back home that the world's ganging up on us. And we needed to shoot out and get real aggressive with everybody and tell them China won't be trifled with. And by the way, we didn't start the virus, you start the virus. And it's really done enormous damage to China's international position over the last 6 months. Maybe Xi knows something that we don't, and things are a lot hairier at home. And he thought that he needed to do this in order to secure political support. Certainly the numbers we're seeing for political support in China are going up right now. So maybe this is a clever plan. But the way the world looks at it, enormously silly way to go about business.
So one last question, Leland. A lot of Americans are out of work right now. Obviously, the economy is in a situation that it has not been in generations, plural. How many Chinese are out of work right now? What is their, for the man on the ground, for the woman on the ground, how is the Chinese economy right now from the perspective of the worker?
Well, it's very interesting because the most opaque part of the most opaque economy is the jobs market. And
right.
we track this, and when we asked firms what they were seeing improvement from Q1, but when we started digging down into the questions, we say, well, wait a second, you're reporting more hiring. Are these furloughed workers that you never reported as laid off that you reported hiring back? And we find some very interesting answers. That their companies are being ordered, governments are being ordered to keep that jobs number in a very tight window. There is no way you have 6% unemployment right now. When a think tank in China came out with a claim that you'd seeing over 20%, that guy mysteriously lost his position, or not so mysteriously lost his position. What do we think's going on here? Of course we know what's going on here. They're not acknowledging huge chunks of the economy that are unemployed. There's a floating migrant population, which is hard to track, but Beijing sort of ignores it when it's inconvenient to talk about layoffs there. So you are seeing the effects of COVID. No one's immune to these. You're seeing widespread losses in the retail and services sector in particular across all these different countries, and China is in a similar position. So they have handled it in some ways better than other countries. But the idea that they're reporting right now, this much better data, jobs are back to normal and growth's almost back to normal, total nonsense. And it's a problem going forward because right now policymakers who just want to hear good news are listening to what Beijing says and, well, hey, China's getting better. That's us 2 or 3 months from now. But what's coming out of China is not what's actually happening in China. It's a sanitized political message. And that's why it's so important to be having these conversations and to be talking about what's really happening in the economic data and in the jobs data.
Well, I'd like to thank you for all this time. I mean, I think our eyes are a lot wider open than they were before as we sit here in this very Soviet-like Cold War with China. Thanks so much for spending the time. Be safe. And hopefully the next time we do this, it'll be face to face.
It was my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.